Did you really think a woman who hadn't changed a single nappy, hadn't sat through one meltdown, hadn't once stayed up until 3 in the morning Googling, how do I help my dyslexic granddaughter stop crying because the letters won't stay still? Did you really think she was going to walk back into our lives with a solicitor and walk out with anything that belonged to my Rosie? I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not a man who raises his voice. I grew up in Timaru, the son of a sheep farmer who believed that quiet men did the most lasting work. My father used to say that the loudest thing on a farm is the animal that's frightened. I've carried that with me for 63 years. I have been quiet through things that would have broken louder men. But when Sandra walked into that mediator's office in Christchurch on a Tuesday morning in March, sat down across from me and my granddaughter, and slid a document across the table claiming legal entitlement to 40% of Rosie's publishing contract, I felt something move in my chest that I hadn't felt since the day Sandra left in the first place. That was 14 years ago. Rosie was 3. I'll start there, because the story doesn't make sense without it. Nothing about Sandra ever made sense unless you understood that she had always treated her life like a series of exits. She left Timaru at 19, came back at 26 with a husband named Derek and a baby on the way. Derek was the sort of man who was charming in short bursts and exhausting over time. They rented a place in Ashburton, and for a while it seemed like it might hold together. Rosie was born in January. She had Sandra's dark hair and Derek's long fingers and, as we would learn much later, a mind that worked in ways that didn't match any of the boxes her teachers would eventually try to put her in. The first signs were subtle. She was slow to read, slow to write, but fast at everything else. She could do a 200-piece jigsaw before she was 4, could remember the exact words of a story read to her 3 weeks earlier, could describe the color of the sky in a way that made you stop and actually look up. But the letters on a page moved for her. That's how she described it when she was older. She said, "Grandad, they just don't sit still. They're always going somewhere." We didn't have a name for it yet. Sandra just had frustration. I think Sandra had expected motherhood to feel a certain way, and when it didn't, when it felt instead like confusion and appointments and a child who needed more than Sandra knew how to give, she began doing what she had always done. She began preparing her exit. Derek left first, which I won't pretend surprised anyone. He was gone by the time Rosie turned 2, off to Wellington with a woman from his office, sending the occasional birthday card with a $50 note tucked inside, as though money posted through a slot could substitute for presents. Sandra lasted another year. Then she rang me on a Wednesday evening, told me she needed to sort herself out, that she was going to Sydney for a few months, that she needed me to take Rosie just for a little while. "I want to be honest with you." I said yes immediately. Not because I wasn't frightened. I was 69 years old, recently widowed, living alone in a 3-bedroom house in Rolleston that felt about twice as large as it needed to be since my wife Margaret had passed. I said yes because Rosie was standing in my hallway with a backpack that had a kiwi embroidered on the front, and she was looking at me with an expression that said she already knew she'd been left, and she was trying to decide if that was going to be all right. I decided it was going to be all right. Sandra's few months became a year, then 2. She rang occasionally, at first Rosie's birthdays, Christmas, once when she'd had a few wines and was feeling something she mistook for guilt. The calls tapered off. By the time Rosie was 6, I had stopped expecting them. We found out about the dyslexia when Rosie was 7. Her teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Houghton, rang me after school one afternoon and said she'd been watching Rosie carefully and she thought we should have an assessment done. I remember sitting at the kitchen table after that call, writing down the names of specialists the way I used to write down the names of vets when Margaret and I had the horses carefully, with the intention of following every single one up. The assessment took 3 sessions. The specialist, a young woman in Christchurch who had a wall covered in children's drawings that her past clients had given her, sat across from me afterward and explained that Rosie had dyslexia, that it was significant, and that it was also in no way a ceiling on what she could achieve. She said, "Mr. Callahan, the research is very clear that dyslexic children who receive the right support and who are given permission to engage with language in alternative ways very often become exceptional communicators. The brain that struggles with text on a page frequently has extraordinary capacity for narrative, for imagery, for original thought." I drove home and told Rosie we'd figured out why the letters moved. She looked at me very seriously and said, "Can we fix it?" I said, "We can teach you to work with it." She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, can we have Marmite toast?" We had Marmite toast. The years that followed were not easy, and I want to be truthful about that because I think there's a version of this story that irons out the hard parts, and I don't want to tell that version. There were evenings when Rosie cried at the kitchen table over pages of homework that refused to cooperate with her. There were parent-teacher evenings where I sat in small plastic chairs and listened to teachers who meant well but didn't quite know what to do with a child who could tell you the entire plot of a novel she'd heard on audiobook, but couldn't write her own name without reversing the letters. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I was doing enough, if Margaret would have known what to do better, if this was more than a 69, then 70, then 72-year-old man could manage on his own. But there was also this. Rosie began to write. Not on paper. Not at first. She dictated. She would sit at the kitchen table after school with a small recorder, an old digital one I'd bought at an electronics shop in Christchurch, and she would talk. Stories, mostly. Long, wandering, intricate stories about children who could talk to the sea, about a lighthouse keeper who collected the last words of ships, about a girl who found a door in the back of a wardrobe that led not to another world, but to a different version of her own. She had been listening to audiobooks since she was 5. Margaret had started her on them. And somewhere in all that listening, she had absorbed a sense of how stories moved, how they breathed, where the weight needed to sit. I would transcribe sometimes. Other times she would do it herself, painstakingly, using software that converted her speech to text. Her specialist had recommended it. We tried 3 different programs before we found one that worked. By the time Rosie was 11, she had 43 stories saved in a folder on her laptop labeled, in her own spelling, "Stories do not delete." I never deleted them. When Rosie was 12, her English teacher, a young man named Mr. Farrell, who had come to teaching late, after a career in publishing, and who had therefore not yet learned to be unsurprised by things, rang me and asked if Rosie had written the piece she'd submitted for the class anthology herself. He said it carefully, the way people do when they're trying not to accuse anyone of anything. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Callahan, I've been in publishing for 11 years. This is one of the most assured pieces of short fiction I've read in quite some time." I said, "She dictates them." He said, "I know. That doesn't change what they are." He entered the piece in a regional school's writing competition without telling us. Rosie came second. She was furious about not coming first. I took her out for fish and chips to celebrate, and she ate them in offended silence for about 4 minutes before she started talking about what she would do differently in the next story, and I sat there eating my chips and thinking, yes, she's going to be fine. She was not, in these years, entirely without a mother. Sandra surfaced occasionally, a phone call here, a card there, once a visit when Rosie was 9 that lasted 3 days, and ended with Sandra saying she needed more time to get her life together and driving away in a rental car while Rosie stood at the front window watching without expression. I watched Rosie's face during that visit more than I watched Sandra's. I was looking for damage. There was some. Rosie didn't cry. She was very tidy in her feelings. Rosie, she folded them up and put them somewhere interior, and occasionally they would surface in her stories. recognizable to me, even when she didn't know I recognized them. There was a story she wrote at 13 about a girl whose mother was like the weather. She came and went without explanation, brought both sun and damage, and the girl learned to stop planning around her. I read that one 3 times. I didn't say anything to Rosie about it. Some things deserve to be kept. Sandra's number changed twice over those years. I kept the most recent one in my phone under her name, without any further comment. I am not someone who deletes people, even when perhaps I should. Rosie was 15 when she wrote the novel. She hadn't set out to write a novel. She had been working on what she thought was a long, short story. Something that kept expanding every time she dictated into it. By the time she realized it was a novel, it was already 60,000 words, and she had no idea what to do with that information. She came to me on a Saturday morning while I was in the garden and said, "Granddad, I think I've written a book by accident." I put down my trowel. I said, "Tell me about it." She did. For 45 minutes, standing in the garden while I sat on the low stone wall, she told me the story of a girl in a small coastal town who discovers that her grandmother has been writing letters to the sea for 40 years, and that the sea has been writing back, and that the letters contain the collected grief of everyone in the town, which the sea has been holding on their behalf, because humans have a limited capacity for carrying their own sorrow. When she finished, I didn't say anything for a moment. She said, "Is it stupid?" I said, "Rosie, it is the least stupid thing I have ever heard." We spent the next year preparing the manuscript. Mr. Farrell, who had since become something of an informal mentor, helped Rosie understand the submission process. She used voice-to-text software, a transcription service, and a patient process of revision that she approached with the same methodical attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. I sat with her on many of those evenings. I didn't contribute the words, they were entirely hers, but I made the tea, and I read the printed pages aloud to her so she could hear them, and occasionally I would say, that bit there, that's the best thing you've written," and she would look slightly embarrassed and pleased and go back to work. She was 16 when she submitted it. She was 17 when the offers came in. I want to describe that afternoon because I want you to understand what it meant. We were in the kitchen, Rosie home from school, still in her uniform, eating an apple and reading something on her laptop when the email arrived from the literary agent in Wellington who had been representing the submission. The agent's name was Diane, and she had a manner of communicating that was consistently calm and therefore made everything feel more significant when it arrived. The email was not calm. It said that 2 publishers in New Zealand and 1 in the United Kingdom had made offers on the manuscript, that there had been an expression of interest from an Australian imprint as well, and that Diane believed, if Rosie wished to proceed, the total advance across territories could be negotiated to somewhere in the vicinity of $2.1 million. Rosie read the email. "Read it again. Put down the apple." She said, "Granddad." I said, "I see it." She said, "That's a lot of money." I said, "It is." She said, "Does this mean the letters worked?" I couldn't speak for a moment. I managed to nod. We rang Diane. Diane explained the process, the timelines, the negotiations still to come. Rosie asked 3 extremely intelligent questions about rights and royalty structures that I could not have formulated myself. Diane laughed and said she wished more of her clients had Rosie's instincts. We hung up. Rosie sat at the kitchen table for a moment in silence. Then she said, "I'm going to keep going to school on Monday," and went to her room to finish her homework. I sat at the kitchen table alone for quite a long time. I thought about Margaret, who had started Rosie on audiobooks, and who had not lived to see this. I thought about the 7-year-old at the kitchen table crying because the letters wouldn't stay still. I thought about 43 stories in a folder labeled "Stories Do Not Delete." I am not a man who cries easily. I have my father's constitution in that regard. But I sat at the kitchen table that evening and I was not entirely dry-eyed. And I think that's all I'll say about that. The news moved, as news does. Mr. Farrell was over the moon. Rosie's school put a small notice in their newsletter. A journalist from a Christchurch paper rang and asked if they could do a piece. Rosie agreed to a short interview, said what she wanted to say, and went back to school. Sandra rang 12 days after the newspaper piece ran. I want to be precise about the timeline. Not because I am a man who keeps score, I genuinely try not to be, but because I think the timing tells you everything you need to know about the nature of the call. I answered. I'm not sure why. I suppose I still had some residual hope. Somewhere beneath the practical layers of the man I've had to be, that she might simply want to say she was proud of her daughter. That the news might have reached her and done the thing it was supposed to do, which was make her feel something true. She said she'd read the article. I said I'd thought she might. She said she'd been meaning to get in touch for a while. I didn't say anything to that. She said she'd been doing a lot of work on herself, that she was in a much better place now, that she'd realized how much she'd missed, and that she wanted to reconnect with Rosie, to be part of her life going forward. To be there for this moment. I said, Sandra, what is the name of Rosie's Year 7 teacher? She was quiet. I said, what did Rosie dress as for Halloween when she was 8? What's the name of Rosie's best friend? What does Rosie order when we go to her favorite restaurant in Christchurch, which she has been going to since she was 10? Still nothing. I said, when Rosie cries, and I know you may not know this, but she does sometimes, at night, when a story isn't going right, and the frustration gets bigger than she can hold when she cries, does she want to be talked to? Or does she want someone to sit quietly in the room with her? Sandra said, that's not fair. I said, Sandra, I'm not trying to be unfair. I'm trying to be accurate. There was a long pause. Then she said she'd spoken to a solicitor. And there it was. The solicitor's position, as it was eventually explained to me through Diane and then through our own family lawyer, a composed and thorough woman in Christchurch named Miss Renata Hopai, was this. Sandra was Rosie's biological mother. Rosie was 17, still a minor for another 4 months. The publishing contract, while negotiated through an agent with my knowledge and involvement, had not been formally executed. Sandra was claiming the right, as the legal guardian of record, a status that had never been formally changed, because we had never gone to court, because I had never pushed for it, because it had never seemed necessary to be party to the contractual arrangements on Rosie's behalf. 40% was the figure Sandra's solicitor had put forward. Miss Hopai's face, when she explained this to me, was professionally still. She said the situation was not uncomplicated, and that while she believed we had strong grounds, particularly given the duration and nature of my care for Rosie, she could not guarantee the outcome. She said, I want to be honest with you, Mr. Callahan. This will require Rosie to be involved in the process. I drove home. I sat in the car in the driveway for several minutes. Then I went inside, and I told Rosie everything. I have always told Rosie everything. Margaret and I agreed on that before Rosie even came to live with us. Though Margaret didn't live to be part of the carrying out of it. We agreed that children who are kept in the dark about the facts of their own lives are not protected by the darkness they are just navigating in it without a torch. So, I told Rosie. I told her about Sandra's call, about the solicitor, about the 40%, about the uncertainty. I told her what Miss Hopai had said. Rosie listened without interrupting, which is something she has done since she was small. She listens to the whole thing before she responds, the way she listened to audiobooks, taking in the full shape of the story before she says anything about it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she doesn't want to know me. She wants to claim me. I said, I think that might be right. She said, there's a difference. I said, I know. She thought for another moment. Then she said, Granddad, "I'd like to come to the meeting." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know. I want to." The mediation was held on a Tuesday morning. Sandra came with her solicitor, a man in his 50s with good shoes, and a manner designed to suggest that everything was reasonable and straightforward when it wasn't. Ms. Huppai sat beside me. Rosie sat beside her. Sandra looked at Rosie when we sat down. I watched her look. There was something in it, something that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of something real, but it arrived too late, and in the wrong context. And Rosie looked back at her mother with the expression of a person who has already written this character and knows exactly what they're capable of. The solicitor spoke first. He outlined Sandra's position, the legal standing, the parental rights, the interest in being part of Rosie's professional life going forward. He used the word family several times, in ways that required significant effort not to respond to. Ms. Huppai responded with precision and without drama, which is what I was paying her for and what she delivered. She outlined the 14 years of sole caregiving, the educational interventions, the financial support, the documented involvement in Rosie's professional development. Then Rosie asked if she could say something. The mediator, a composed woman who had clearly seen most varieties of family difficulty, looked at Rosie and said yes. Rosie had a single page in front of her. She had written it herself, the night before, using her voice to text, and then printing it out. She had asked me to read it aloud to her 3 times so she could hear it, and each time she had made small adjustments. I had not told her what to say. I had not suggested a strategy. I had just read it back to her when she asked and said, "The 3rd time, Rosie. This is exactly right." She read it in the room. I won't give you the words precisely because they are hers, and she will likely publish them someday in some form, and that is her right. But the shape of it was this. She spoke about what it means to tell a story. She said that every story has 2 parts, the part that is written and the part that is lived first. She said the living is the harder part and the less visible part, and the part that no contract can reach back and claim. She said her grandfather had been present for every word of the living, every morning reading, every recorded story, every evening at the kitchen table, every appointment, every small victory, and that her mother had been present for none of it. She said she was not making this point in anger. She said she was making it as a writer, which meant she was making it as precisely and honestly as she knew how. She said that authorship is not biology. It is presence. It is attention. It is the willingness to sit with someone in the difficult parts without knowing how it ends. She said, "My grandfather is the co-author of everything I've written, not because he wrote any of the words, but because he stayed in the room." There was a silence when she finished. Sandra's solicitor looked at his notepad. Sandra was looking at Rosie with an expression I didn't entirely know how to read. It might have been shame. It might have been something else. I have thought about it since, and I still can't be certain. The mediation did not resolve that day. These things don't, usually. But Sandra withdrew the 40% claim within the week. Miss Huppai rang to tell me on a Friday afternoon. She said, "I think your granddaughter's statement had more to do with that outcome than any legal argument I made." I thanked her. I sat in the garden after the call and looked at the vegetable beds that Rosie had helped me plant at the start of the season. She had insisted on the specific placement of the tomatoes because she'd read about companion planting and had a theory about the basil, and I thought about things. For a while, Rosie's book came out the following autumn. It was called The Sea-Zone Letters, and it was dedicated, simply, to G, who stayed in the room. The reviews were kind, and more than kind. A reviewer in a Wellington paper wrote that it read like a book written by someone who had been listening their whole life. A reviewer in the United Kingdom wrote that the prose had a quality of earned stillness that was rare in a debut, rare in any book. Diane rang to say the UK edition had gone into a second printing within 3 weeks. Rosie went back to school on the Monday after the launch. She finished her final year. She was accepted into a creative writing program at Victoria University of Wellington, which she starts next year. Before she left for orientation week, we sat in the kitchen and had tea. She said, "Granddad, I know you worry about what happens when you're not around." I said, "I'm 63, Rosie. I intend to be around for some time." She smiled. She said, "I know, but I want you to know that I've thought about it, and it's going to be fine. I know who I am now. The writing taught me that, and you taught me that knowing who you are is the thing no one can come back and take from you." I didn't say anything. I just drank my tea. Outside the window, the tea coca we'd planted 3 years ago, in memory of Margaret, was doing well. Rosie had chosen the spot. She said it needed to be somewhere it could see the whole garden. It's taller now than she is. It stands there in all weathers, rooted where it was placed. And I find, when I look at it in the morning, that it settles something in me. I've been asked sometimes, by people who know the story, whether I resent the years, whether I feel I gave up something. I am honest when I answer this, which is that I gave up some things, and I would give them all up again in the order they came. I gave up a quieter retirement. I gave up the kind of ease that you are theoretically owed at 63. I gave up the version of myself that would have rattled around that large house in Rolleston with nothing requiring him. And in exchange I got Rosie, who has taught me more about the nature of intelligence, the nature of language, the nature of what it means to persist through difficulty than any other experience of my life. She is 18 now, and she is heading to Wellington. And she is more herself than any person I have met. I will miss her in the ordinary daily way, the way you miss a sound when the house goes quiet. But she will ring on Sundays. She already told me she'll ring on Sundays, and Rosie, when she says a thing, means it. For those of you watching who are caring for a child that the world hasn't yet figured out how to place, a child whose mind moves in directions that don't fit the standard shapes, who struggles with the things that seem easy for others, but sees things that others walk straight past. I want to say what that specialist said to me in her office in Christchurch 16 years ago, because I have found it to be completely true. There is no ceiling. The brain that fights with the conventional form of a thing is often the brain most capable of inventing a new form entirely. What looks like limitation from the outside is sometimes just a different architecture. And different architecture, given time and attention and someone willing to stay in the room, builds things the rest of us couldn't have imagined. The letters don't have to sit still to make something true. They just have to end up in the right order.